Excellent. Well, you're all very quick back from coffee break, so well done you after an enjoyable extended coffee break, an opportunity to warm up a little, ready for this next splendid session, part 2, architectural manipulation. I should just introduce myself very quickly. I'm an architecturalist, Jeremy Musson, an architecture historian and specialist in the English country house. I also do some teaching, Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, and with New York University University in London students, as I was in Apsley House and Leighton House, where windows play a very important part, only yesterday. And I'm very delighted to be part of this remarkable intellectual focus on the role of the window. I couldn't help reflecting on the train this morning on my memory of writing a little essay on the sash window years ago, and being referred to the definition of sash in Dr. Johnson's 1755 Dictionary of the English Language. Sash. Of this word, the etymologists give no account. I suppose it comes from sash, of savoir, to know. A sash window being made particularly for the sake of seeing or being seen. As we know, completely incorrect. It comes from a French word to do with moving parts, the same derivation as the chassis of an engine. But how interesting that a contemporary observer of the ever-present sash window should see it as a thing, not just from seeing through, but being seen through as well. And we're going to talk about that in our current session, looking both at the complex and intriguing world of the window as a presence in the academic building context, as well as the even more charged territory of the relationship between the window and the landscape in the picturesque. Our two speakers, our first speaker is Stephen Lauritano, who is a university lecturer in architectural history at the University of Leiden, where faculty he joined in 2020, before which he earned his master's in architecture from Princeton University and a PhD in the history of art from Yale University. And as I say, Stephen will speak on windows of learning, Robert Adam, William Henry Playfair, and the Old College at the University of Edinburgh. Our second speaker is Rebecca Tropp. Rebecca is archivist at the renowned Crosby Moran Hall in London and an affiliated lecturer in the history of art at the University of Cambridge. We also heard how Rebecca introduced the idea of this wonderful conference while working with the Paul Mellon in the research and events convener. And also at Cambridge, she's been the acting assistant director of the Axon Johnson Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture at Downing College in Cambridge, which new institution has done a lot to expand the study of historic architecture at the university. Rebecca holds a PhD in the history of art from the University of Cambridge, where she also earned her MPhil. We have two speakers, just the two papers, then our question and answer. So please keep your questions for the question and answer sessions. And then we have, of course, lunch, which I'm sure you're all anticipating. So with no further ado, Stephen, please take the stage. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to Rebecca for the invitation and giving me an opportunity to think intensely about windows. Also to Ella and Kathleen for taking impeccable care of us over the course of the symposium. And also to Jeremy for that wonderful anecdote. That really was a perfect way to get things started before my talk. So the point of departure for my contribution this morning is the Old College building for the University of Edinburgh, which is viewed here in its 4 main elevations, which I have strung together. It is a complex building with a complicated construction history. It was originally designed by Robert Adam in 1788 and eventually completed by William Henry Playfair in the first decades of the 19th century. It seems to present us with a more or less unified face, but the long construction period and the series of different contributors have resulted in a veritable catalog of classical window types. I tried to count them and I came up with at least 16 different species of windows arrayed across the 4 main exterior facades. But if you can count more, please let me know. What do these windows do? They bring light in, they organize the axes of the facades, they set up a regular rhythm of bays, but they also help to differentiate portions of this large complex in terms of their function. The building was designed to accommodate a range of purposes: classrooms, lecture halls, laboratories, libraries, multiple museums, and accommodations for the professors, all on the other side of this facade. Urbanistically, the windows help to give the building a presence, and certain portions come forward with heightened monumentality because of the windows. So you get, for example, the distinctive windows for the triumphal entrance, which you see here, and also other specialized window arrangements for the museum spaces, for the academic senate, and so on. So far, so good. You might say these are standard features of classical architecture. But in my comments this morning, I will focus on a group of windows in this building that attracted especially strong responses from the architects who visited during the first decades of the 19th century. In this case, the window is not only serving as a protagonist, but also as a provocateur, an element of the architecture that elicits a reaction, that provokes thought and critique. And so that's what I will try to elucidate in my 15 minutes this morning. What prompted the strong reactions among two leading architects of this period when they visited the Old College and saw its windows? To answer that question, we need to know a little bit about what was going on in neoclassicism during this time. Julien David Leroy's Ruins of the Most Beautiful Monuments of Greece had already appeared in 1758. James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette's Antiquities of Athens followed not long after. These publications opened up a new world of classical architecture that had been, with a few important exceptions, off limits to Europeans due to Ottoman control of the territories in question. But by the early 19th century, which is a generation later, young architects had pored over these volumes and they had entered the mainstream of architectural education. On the one hand, this brought a renewed interest in archaeological accuracy, so using the correct forms in the correct ways, but also an increasing investment in the creative possibilities of the Greek motifs and the tensions produced as the Greek precedents mingled and sometimes clashed with the more familiar canon of classical architecture derived from Roman examples. This was the milieu in which two leading architects of the early 19th century, Carl Friedrich Schinkel and Charles Robert Cockerell, were educated, and it prepared them to react to the Old College building in particular ways. They each visited the building in the 1820s, and they recorded their reactions in their diaries, as you can read here. So Schinkel, he sees mistakes, a lack of feeling for proportion, and a series of experiments, which, if you read between the lines, he interprets as failed experiments. Cockerell is even more expressive, even more fired up. He calls some of the choices made by Playfair nonsense, and he seems to suggest a staleness and a lack of knowledge in the application of classical forms, declaring, as usual, the example is followed as far as it leads and then blank. We can go no further. Here we have two portraits of our architect critics. And I was especially pleased to find an example for each one of them that falls within the romantic figure at the open window type. Cockerell, this is just a side note, but Cockerell looks much older, and this image was taken at the end of his life. But Schinkel and Cockerell were near contemporaries. So Schinkel was born in 1781, Cockerell in 1788. Around the time that Cockerell visited the Old College, he had returned from a 7-year grand tour earlier, and then he had been busy for several years preparing finished drawings based on the buildings and monuments he experienced during those travels. Schinkel saw the Old College as part of his own journey through France, England, and Scotland in the year 1826. And as a plug, you can read Schinkel's full travel diary in translation in the beautifully illustrated publication that the Paul Mellon Center released in 1993. And some have actually called Schinkel's visit to Britain a mission of industrial espionage, as he made detailed drawings of the factories, potteries, and other sites of technological innovation that he visited along the way. But it was also an important opportunity for him to check in with the latest developments in contemporary architecture. And Schinkel was particularly curious about Cockerell. He called on Cockerell at Cockerell's London abode, but unfortunately the architect was not home. And Schinkel was especially envious that Cockerell had been to Greece and had been able to study the classical monuments in person, which is something he was never able to do. But let's take a closer look at Schinkel's commentary on this building. He notes the use of pilasters and the details derived from Greek monuments, but he also notices something in the composition of the building that he refers to as my system. And I think this is a surprising turn of phrase. Classicist architecture is based on Vitruvius and his later interpreters, Vignola, Palladio, etc. It sources its motifs and its orders and its basic arrangements from existing monuments. So why is Schinkel talking about my system? And what are the mistakes made by Robert Adam and William Henry Playfair in deploying this system? Well, that becomes somewhat clear if we look at the original diary page, which also includes Schinkel's sketches. And we can see that the system to which he is referring is somehow related to window openings. So here I have enlarged detail so we can see more easily. And you can look closely and you see that word scribbled between the sketches is Universität, university, in Schinkel's 19th century Prussian script. So which windows then are the provocateurs? What made it into Schinkel's sketches? Well, the example in the right of the detail I'm showing here is easy to identify. It's an arrangement of windows that appears actually repeatedly across the facade of Old College. And it is a combination of a tripartite opening below, which is formed by two columns and two engaged pilasters, and then a simplified Serlian window above, also in three parts, with the arched opening in the center and two rectangular openings on either side. But what about the larger of the two sketches in the detail, the sketch on the left? Can you find that window in the facade? Well, here Schinkel does something interesting. He edits Adam's design and he takes the round arched tripartite window and the tripartite opening formed by the columns and pilasters, and he recombines them in what he considers to be their correct positioning. Round arched opening above, trabeated system, that is columns and beam, below. Now, this arrangement looks much more familiar to us, like the thermal window or the Diocletian window, as it is termed. And this is a Roman window type that is used to bring light into those vast vaulted spaces of the public baths. The round shape relates to the vaulting of the ceiling, but the openings are so large that those intervening vertical supports are added. It's a truly monumental form. And from the perspective of historical usage, it's somewhat curious that Adam uses the thermal window in the lower story and places the columned window above. But it's not so strange, and architects had been using this window type in non-conventional and expressive ways since the Renaissance. Here you see one of the most famous examples, the rear facade of Andrea Palladio's Villa Foscari. And it was, of course, via Palladio that this motif made its way to British architecture in the work of 18th century architects like Richard Boyle. So why then does Schinkel have the audacity to refer to this arrangement as my system and correct Adam's building accordingly? Well, here is Schinkel's system, illustrated in a drawing, and I hope you can see it. It's not the best image. This is a drawing that he created for an unrealized publication. And you can recognize, especially in the lower register, the basic arrangement of the thermal window or the Diocletian window. But there's something else going on here. Rather than showing an interest in the original context of the historical form, Schinkel is taking the basic arrangement and he's thinking through its constructive possibilities as part of a broader tectonic problem. How to combine arcuated construction, that is a building method based on round arches, with a trabeated system based on vertical supports and horizontal spanning members. For Schinkel, it is precisely this combination of arcuation and trabeation that the thermal window represents, more than a kind of vast bath. And when he's thinking through this problem, this tectonic identity, he's thinking about it across a range of scales and variations, depending on the number of vertical members in the window type. So in this drawing in particular, we see that for Schinkel, a window is not just a window, it is the pivotal focal point of tectonic interest in a building, and also a point of tectonic risk. It is a moment of uncertainty in the structural diagram that the architect has to navigate. How to redirect the load of all that masonry and redirect those forces in a way that makes this opening possible. And then how to express this both externally and internally in a way that makes the statics visible and reveals in a poetic and elegant way the structural truth of the arrangement. We can see some further evidence of his thinking on this particular problem in this sketch made in either 1826 or 1827. And in that series along the left edge, Schinkel works through 4 fusions of arch and post and beam. So at the top, example A, for him, that's his false example. The insertion of arches in the rectilinear framework suggests to him that the columns are not strong enough to hold up the architrave on their own. So he says, young architects avoid that. Example B, he says, is just as sturdy as example A from a structural perspective, but has the advantage of greater clarity, and the window openings are larger. They let more light in. But his preferred system is example C. It places the arches above the architrave. And this arrangement combines the additional strength achieved from the arches with the visual tectonic clarity of the column and beam system. And finally, in example D, he shows one possible way to incorporate this into a full facade. So Schinkel developed these ideas in relation to a specific commission, which he was working on during the time of his journey through France, England, and Scotland. And that commission was for a theater building for the city of Hamburg. Here you can see the facade detail and the large areas of window that Schinkel is able to open up by utilizing his system. The Hamburg Theater is one of the most important commissions that Schinkel completed outside of Prussia and outside of the context of his official position as Oberbaurat, or senior building inspector for the Prussian state. So Schinkel was approached in 1825 by a private group of stockholders, mostly merchants, who formed a society to build a new public theater building for their city. And it was to accommodate 2,000 patrons, but it also needed to include 10 boutiques at street level. So we have a link to the shop windows panel from this morning. And the idea was that the income from the rent of these spaces would help make the building more financially feasible. So in addition to the theater and the shops, it also needed to include a workshop for scenery painters, rehearsal rooms, a library, a kitchen for a pastry maker, apparently, dressing rooms, a series of foyers, staircases, and vestibules. And Schinkel writes about this project in the published edition of his collected works, the Sammlung. He writes, quote, "In order to have enough light for this number of rooms, all to be distributed along the face of the building, an architecture had to be chosen which would provide for a great number of adjacent sources of light. However, such a large number of windows in the typical form, distributed over 5 stories, would make the building look like a barracks, and would not characterize it as a public building. For that reason, I designed an arch construction which is divided by a continuous entablature and further divided by pilasters supporting the arches. These divisions result in 2 stories per arch. Each arch accommodates windows for 2 rooms. Thus, the facade only expresses the construction of 2 main stories, but the vestibules, foyers, stage, and orchestra use the entire height of the arches, since these rooms require higher ceilings." So, yeah, in case that didn't land, the point here is that Schinkel is designing the building from the outside in, or windows first, rather than attaching a particular window type to an existing room in accordance with its purpose and status. He creates a complex window facade system that can accommodate a variety of rooms behind it, sometimes on 1 floor and sometimes spanning 2 floors, and all coming together in this distinctive unified shell. And Schinkel was proud of this innovation. At the end of his text, he says, for architects who are reading this, I would like to add that to my knowledge, this advantageous arrangement is not yet widely used. And I couldn't resist showing this image as well. His pride about this building is also on display in this suggestive image of the theater's interior. So here the proscenium arch becomes a window in its own right, through which the audience sees a view of the building they are sitting within. And Schinkel's innovative window facade takes center stage here for a bow. In the remaining time, I'll turn back very briefly to Cockerell. Yeah, and we can place him on the other side of the window because he is reacting once again to a tectonic disposition of a window frame, but in this case, it's on the inside of the structure. He's inside the old college, looking out, and it's precisely the confusion between inside and outside created by Playfair's use of the classical elements that perturbs him. Cockerell's comments are inspired by a space located here, the so-called Lower Museum, which occupies the central portion of the western facade. And so from the outside, you can see that the lower floor is quite plain in terms of its windows, but the inside of this space is where Playfair places that Doric set of columns with entablature. So in the upper left, you can see Playfair's section elevation drawing. There are brick vaults below that support the floor, and they align with the Doric columns above, but the role of these columns within the room is not clear or obvious. They flank the windows in an awkward way and bring a kind of solemn monumentality that clashes with the sense of grand domesticity evoked by the window frames. These columns were not, in fact, part of Adam's original design, and you can see in the plan on the left that Playfair copied after Adam, that he added the columns in with pencil. As the university changed over time and converted this lower museum space into a different function, Playfair's tricky column window combination is dealt with in various not entirely satisfactory ways. So here on the right, you see that the windows were simply covered over, and this transforms the Doric columns into engaged columns and renders the entablature as a decorative ceiling border. Then in the 1970s, Ian G. Lindsay and partners converts the space into the Senate Hall. They open the windows back up and they draw attention to the columns and entablature with a new color scheme. But I think the awkwardness remains, and you can see the Doric order is too close to the windows. It essentially functions here as a second set of curtains, which is an intriguing allusion perhaps to the notion that the fluting of the columns derives from the pleats of the Greek chiton, but it's not the kind of tectonic expressivity that Cockerell and Schinkel aspired to achieve. In Cockerell's commentary from his diary entry in 1822, he says, I would have shown the beams and so made an ornamental and reasoned ceiling, as did the ancients. And that is precisely what he did 8 years later in this remarkable design for a divinity school space, which he placed on the ground floor of his 1830 competition design for the Cambridge University Library. And I think this is definitely inspired by his Edinburgh Old College encounter. So now the Doric columns are pulled further away from the windows, and the role in the structural diagram is easier to read. He exposes the beams so that the triglyphs above in the entablature make sense. And the height of the window openings itself now corresponds with the underside of the beams. So it's clear that this is an integrated tectonic system. The light streams in, it rakes across the columns, and it picks up their fluting. It's not so much that Cockerell is a stickler for the rules. He still is willing to place the Doric entablature inside the room, but he wants to expose the parts to show that they work together and take advantage of the opportunities to create additional ornament, all in a combination that feels reasoned, but also expresses his creativity. This is my last slide. I'd like to end my whirlwind remarks on provocative windows by returning to the portraits of Schinkel and Cockerell, and I've added a third example of the genre, another romantic figure at the window. This is the beautiful painting by Louise Adéon Droling from 1821. And often we think of the romantic yearning condensed in such a window picture as a separate phenomenon from the more methodical process of drawing and comparative study that I've been working through today. But in fact, the two are contemporary and they are connected. In the Droling painting, the young woman is using the window as a light box to trace a landscape. So this is also a means of using the window as a substrate for learning. That careful, absorptive act of drawing and tracing can coexist with the light and the world of practical experience framed by the window's mullions. Obsessing about the minutiae of window tectonics is also a kind of Sehnsucht, I would argue, a yearning both to connect with the past, to learn from it, but also a desire to understand architecture as an expressive medium, one that provokes us. And to experience that expression, you have to study its language, but you also have to travel and witness it and let it strike you, as Schinkel and Cockrell did in Edinburgh. Thank you so much for your attention.
Such a fascinating deep dive into the architectural power of the window within an architectural design. I think that's very stimulating. And I'd like to ask Rebecca to come to the stage to talk to us about windows and the picturesque. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. By now, you probably know who I am, but I'm actually going to speak to you about my research now. The picturesque, arguably Britain's most distinctive contribution to global culture, became the country's dominant aesthetic in the later 18th and early 19th centuries. Initially conceived as a way of seeing and describing landscape, it ultimately became a major influence on architecture, resulting in country houses that, rather than standing apart and overlooking formal gardens, were designed to be grounded, both physically and figuratively, within a visually curated but ostensibly natural landscape. And when I say natural, I don't really mean natural, but it looked natural. In general, these houses were characterized by a broad eclecticism of style, an embracing of asymmetry, an arrangement of parts and placement of apertures that emphasized the framing of views, and an experience that was predicated on a moving spectator. And I'm just showing a few examples by John Nash, just to give you a sense of that. Given these underlying aesthetic and experiential objectives, it is perhaps surprising that architectural historians have largely focused on matters of style, rather than acknowledging and analyzing fundamental changes in the interface between the built and natural worlds, between humans and their environment. Seeking to realize these objectives, in fact, presented a number of architectural challenges and choices that have not previously been investigated in any methodical detail. My approach, therefore, has been to analyze the physical repercussions of the picturesque on the creation of three-dimensional, lived-in spaces through which visually manifested scenes might be achieved. My focus has been on the real-world architectural responses and solutions that mediated the relationship, boundaries, transitions, and interactions between house and garden, and how those solutions contributed to addressing such issues as grounding, framing, access, and movement. Central to the picturesque in architecture was the increase in what one might term permeable boundaries, which can be said to exist whenever there is an aperture in an exterior wall of the house, or occasionally in the roof, blurring the boundaries between inside and outside. These include windows, glazed doors, and attached conservatories, as well as open loggias and verandas, some of which were seasonally glazed. The forms and functions of these various types of glazed openings took on a new significance when the principal floor was built at or near ground level, facilitating more direct interaction between house and garden. At its most basic level, such a permeable boundary may allow for the admission of light, the exchange of air, the transmission of visual information, and/or the physical movement of bodies across a glazed or open aperture in the built fabric of a house. The first three are what Henty Lowe, an eminent Windows historian, has grouped as the primary, quote, functional objectives of a window. I class these as forms of passive permeability, given that the receiving of light, air, or views can all occur whilst one remains within the house. The fourth function is what I term active permeability, the potential for physical movement through the boundary from inside to outside, or vice versa. In the later 18th century, writings by William Gilpin and others encouraged readers to seek out picturesque landscapes, scenes reminiscent of the 17th century paintings of Claude Lorrain, Nicolas Poussin, and Salvator Rosa, and to record them in painting or writing, thereby appreciating existing scenes, but without direct involvement or interference. However, in the early 1790s, at a time when the Napoleonic Wars prohibited travel abroad and domestic tourism was expanding, publications by landed gentry Richard Payne Knight and Uvidal Price, and especially by professional landscape gardener Humphrey Repton, laid out how estate owners could actively create and redesign the domestic landscape according to certain principles. Repton argued that landscape gardeners must have, quote, competent knowledge of architecture and of the effect of buildings on the surrounding scenery. But his concern extended far beyond external surface treatment to more fundamental considerations of how a building fit within and interacted with its surroundings. He characterized the different kinds of fixed views one ought to consider in one's design, view proper, prospect, panorama, etc., and also laid out a hierarchy of viewpoints. So those from the house to the landscape, those from the landscape to the house, and those throughout the landscape itself. In his 1803 Observations on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, he noted that, quote, views from a window were of little consequence at a time when glass was hardly transparent, and in many of the ancient castles, the small lozenge panes were glazed with colored glass, shout out to colored glass, or painted with armorial bearings, which admitted light without any prospect. In his own time, however, with improvements in the size and quality of glass panes, framed views became of central importance. In his final book of 1816, he wrote, quote, there is no subject connected with landscape gardening of more importance or less attended to than the window through which the landscape is seen. Repton, along with many other contemporaneous written sources, including private journals, published lectures, periodicals, and architectural pattern books, noted the growing fashion for extending windows down to the ground, further emphasizing the possibility of being able to walk directly outdoors. Quote, in treating the subject of windows, he suggested some notice may be taken of the modern improvement, borrowed from the French, of folding glass doors opening into a garden, by which the effect of a room is like that of a tent or marquee, and in summer delightful. Repton was evidently referring to what we would now call French windows or French doors, so full-length casement or side-hinged windows. But many full-length windows were instead sliding sashes, which use an internal pulley system with weights to slide up and down. Given the desire to engage more closely with the gardens outside one's home, and hence the growing fashion for full-length windows, a question then arises as to why one window type might have been chosen over another. Oh. I'm going to stay here. Sash windows were more flexible than casements in terms of their ventilation properties, as they could be opened by varying degrees at top and or bottom, improving the circulation of air in buildings. During cold weather, this meant that the window could be opened at the top, avoiding direct drafts, as would be the case with an open casement window, where air could flow into the room around the window's full perimeter. Sash windows also provided more uninterrupted views, having a wide frame solely around the edge of the sash, as opposed to around the edge of both doors in a French window. And they were better able to support the weight of large sheets of plate glass, the highest quality glass available, whereas casements were supported by hinges on only one side. Despite the benefits of the sash window, the casement window was found superior in other regards. Casement windows could be opened more fully, whereas in general, only about half the area of a sash window could be open at a time, providing for maximum airflow between interior and exterior. Furthermore, although sash windows could be made full length such that one could walk through the opening, French windows enabled greater ease of movement between house and garden. Casement windows were also considered more historically accurate for Gothic buildings during the 19th century. Although various leading British architects began experimenting with French windows in the final 2 decades of the 18th century, many were skeptical of their use in place of sash windows, which remained the staple form of fenestration through the end of the 19th century. The concealed pulley system of sash windows made for an arguably neater appearance and greater ease of movement, but these came at a monetary cost, with sash windows being considerably more expensive than casements, and that's not even bringing into the story those taxes on windows and on glass that we heard about earlier. Both types of windows went in and out of favor at different times and for a variety of reasons. Surviving drawings and extant buildings demonstrate the tensions between choosing one type of window over the other for any given building, or indeed for different rooms within the same house. Through analysis of this material, it becomes possible to hypothesize further as to what architect and patron were perhaps seeking experientially in their houses. As one particularly interesting case study, I'm going to focus on James Wyatt's Ashridge house, which fully embraced both passive and active permeability, and perhaps more significant for my purposes here, has a variety of surviving documentation, including changes to its fenestration in the late 19th century, which readily invites analysis in terms of how its windows affected lived experience. James Wyatt embarked on Ashridge House in about 1807. Built in Hertfordshire for John William Egerton, the 7th Earl of Bridgewater, it would be the largest, and due to his sudden death in 1813, also the last of his Gothic houses. In the final design as executed, the main block of the house, with a tower at its center, is flanked to the west by the offices and to the east by an angled wing containing private apartments, which is further extended by an orangery bent at a second angle. From end to end, the house extends about 1,000 feet, and the spire of the chapel originally reached a height of 142 feet. My focus here is on the central block of the house, which was essentially completed by the time of Wyatt's death, rather than the service wing to the west of the chapel or apartments and orangery to the east, which were completed later by Wyatt's nephew, Sir Geoffrey Wyattville. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the ground floor garden front facing south and east, as that is where direct physical movement can most readily occur between interior and exterior. As a neo-Gothic building, one might expect that the house would utilize hinged casement windows throughout, as it largely does now. However, this was not the case when it was originally built. The ground floor openings of all but the anteroom on the south front have been significantly altered, with the arched windows of the dining room and drawing room crisscrossed with thin glazing bars, having been replaced with rectilinear, uninterrupted plate glass. The top 2/3 of each window is fixed, and the bottom third is a French window. The 11 openings of the conservatory were also later closed up and replaced with small rectangular windows. These changes to Ashridge's fenestration are fortuitously captured in a photograph circa 1869 to 72, which shows the south front partway through its window replacement. And I must thank Mick Thompson, who was based at Ashridge for a very long time, for showing this photo to me, which was very helpful. While previous scholarship has briefly noted the extensive alterations that were made later in the 19th century, the implications in terms of permeability have not been addressed. Without going into the details of my investigation, I can summarize that the windows of the south-facing conservatory once matched those of the east-facing library, both originally having been casement-style French windows, whereas the windows of the dining room and drawing room match those that still exist in the anteroom between the two rooms, namely full-length sliding sashes. The question then arises as to why Wyatt chose to utilize two different types of full-length windows in these ground floor spaces, and therefore how those decisions reflected the differing usages intended or expected for each room. The French windows of the conservatory evidently would have allowed for the maximum amount of ventilation for the space, perhaps necessary in the summer when the conservatory might otherwise become overheated and cause damage to any plants remaining indoors, as well as provided the greatest ease of movement from inside to outside. It is somewhat less clear why French windows would also have been chosen for the library, but one might expect that having the more unobstructed views obtainable with sash windows would not have been as important from that room, where one would generally have spent one's time reading, writing, or otherwise engaged in focused activities. At the same time, French windows would have facilitated movement from the library out to its covered cloister, which would in turn have offered some protection from the direct draft of an open casement. For the drawing room, however, sash windows would appear a logical choice, as one would want the least obstructed views of the garden from that room, along with the ability to vary the amount of ventilation in the space. Views were generally not considered as important in dining rooms, but Wyatt's adherence to symmetry would require that the dining room's windows match those of the drawing room. In the case of both those rooms and the anteroom between, the emphasis may have been more on maximizing light, views, and control over the amount of air penetrating the rooms, hence passive permeability, than on the ability to physically walk back and forth from inside to outside as in the conservatory and library. One could, of course, still have moved between house and garden from the sash-windowed rooms, but it might be expected that the windows would simply have been left open during nice weather, whereas the French windows of the conservatory or library could be more easily opened and then closed after one passed through them, making them preferable for use in less favorable or simply more variable weather. The specific choices that Wyatt made for Ashridge are just one example of the relationship between windows themselves and their role in facilitating framing and mediating the interface between inside and outside, house and garden, people and landscape. John Nash, the architect perhaps most readily associated with the picturesque, frequently utilized asymmetrical planning, principal floors located at ground level, full-length windows and attached conservatories to facilitate both passive and active engagement with the landscape. At Luscombe Castle, for example, he used sash windows throughout the ground floor, giving primacy to the views he established by orienting the rooms to face specific directions. As stipulated on his drawings, some of these windows had false heads, enabling the window to slide upward into the wall, quote, high enough to look out when a tall man is standing up. The one location where Nash utilized French windows was in the seasonally glazed veranda, where they were removed entirely during the warmer months and then hung to create a glazed conservatory in winter. Sir John Soane's designs and writings, on the other hand, emphasize passive rather than active permeability, in effect creating interior landscapes, as at his own home in Lincoln's Inn Fields, now Sir John Soane's museum. His placement and discussion of windows focused, for the most part, on their abilities to transmit light and air, as well as their contributions to the character of the building, rather than on the possibilities of physical movement from the house out into the garden. At Pitsanger Manor, the villa Soane built for his family in Ealing, French doors were used for ease of access from both the drawing room and library into the conservatory, but the conservatory itself was elevated above ground level without direct access to the gardens, and therefore was glazed with large sliding sashes. Through these and many other examples, a close study of physical windows can give us a figurative window into the experiential intentions of architects and patrons of the period. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for an absolutely wonderful deep dive in a short time into two extremely rich territories. I was interested, Stephen, that you mentioned that Cockerell and Schinkel have these two rather distinctive, they're both criticizing the building and they have their specific points of view. What do you make of the differences between their comments?
That's
better to hold it if you can.
Yeah.
And hold it close.
Yeah, in a way, even though Cockerell seems more outraged, I think that his criticism is ultimately more generous in a way, because he seems to acknowledge that he's also going to draw inspiration from this building, that classicism is still very much a dialogue at this point in time. And yeah, even though he calls it nonsense, then he really produces a design that seems to be so directly inspired by the experience that, yeah, it's not a kind of pure negativity. I think Schinkel's response, it's maybe less generous in a way, but it shows that he's thinking about architecture in a much more technical respect. And there's a great debate whether it's true or not, but some scholars say that he was working on a kind of textbook for architecture students that was never published, and he never could finish it. He was too busy. And that kind of more schoolmaster attitude comes through, I would say, in his critique. But then it also produces this incredible building in Hamburg. So,
which was wonderful to see. Rebecca, do you want to comment on that, or should I get to you on a question for you? Is that I was the description in Pride and Prejudice came to mind when you were talking when Lizzie Bennet is being shown around the rooms, but in every description, all she does is walk across to the window, and we get a description of the landscape. In fact, we get virtually nothing about the architecture, which seems to me a very good expression of what you've been describing. But how much was it a new sensibility at the time of these buildings that you're showing us?
Of the importance of the view, you mean? Well, I mean, the view is in these houses. So I did mention that, and people are hearing me. Is it close enough? Okay. I mean, the view starts being theorized a lot more, but also as much as there was the window tax and the glass tax, from what I've researched, it doesn't affect the wealthiest people. So they were using the most expensive glass and they were using a lot of windows. Even though the window tax was not just by window, it was in increments. So let's say the first 10 were at a certain rate, the next 10, it becomes exponential. It's extremely expensive and it didn't affect them. So clearly having the windows was very important. The view was very important. And actually that is linked as well to the idea of colored glass and stained glass, because we were talking about, why don't more people have colored glass or stained glass in their windows? And especially in a lot of houses that were in the Gothic style, although not all in the Gothic style, the way that they get around that, or that they want to include colored glass or stained glass, but they also want the views. And how do you get both of those? Is that they would have clear panes or clear glass in the lower parts of the windows, and then have the colored glass at the top, so that you got a bit of both. So you got that Gothic gloom, or you got that exoticism, let's say at Sezencote in their conservatory. but you also got those views because they were so important. And I also look kind of theorizing at the way that they're framing those views and the way that they're, as windows get bigger, Repton, the landscape architect, talks about how do you break up a larger landscape into what he calls vignettes. And you could do that through, which is also connected to Leroy and his use of columns to divide up a scene. Repton says, planting trees and evenly spaced to divide up a larger scene. But I think the exterior skin of the building, the spaces between the windows, as the windows get wider, it becomes not individual windows that you go up to, but if you stand back, then it becomes these larger panoramas that are divided up into vignettes. So it's all of those ideas of the views around the garden are also happening from within the house out to the garden. And I think also the use of columns, screens of columns within houses are creating a landscape also within the house and kind of blurring the distinctions of what is landscape, what is garden. But again, we could talk about control and that this is all different ways. It may not be formal gardens, it might not be, but it is showing control in different ways, even if less obvious over
Thank you.
landscape.
And any questions from the floor? One here.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I've got a question for Stephen. I was wondering, as you quoted the diary excerpts, in how far their opinion made it into public.
Yeah, I think they were speaking in an unguarded way because it was private. It was meant to be private. And they were both, they had interesting approaches to diary writing. Cockrell was prolific as a diary writer. He really had discipline about it, and he kept a diary. He wrote at least 250 words every day for, I think, a 6-year stretch before he kind of ran out of steam. Schinkel, it was more so, especially when he traveled, he would, we actually get some of his best commentary on architecture from his travel diaries. But in both cases, this wasn't an example of one of those travelogues that was written to be received by a public like Buchner Muskau's. These were private comments.
Hi there. Again, I agree. Two great talks, but my question is also for Stephen. I'm currently working in an architectural history of University College London, just across the road here, where we also have a catalogue of different classical window types from about 200 years. It's probably more of an observation than a question, but I wondered, Schinkel's criticism of that Adam window arrangement, I see as more grounded in, it's more an expression of his own belief. He's very much interested in archaeological accuracy.
Yeah.
And as you said, to him, it's the structural integrity of the window. I don't think he fully understands that Adam's idea, he wants emotional impact.
Yeah.
He's much more a picturesque classicist. And therefore, I don't think Schinkel can understand or appreciate what lies behind the design. I just wonder what you thought of that.
I'll give a short answer. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That it's missed on him, the intended impact. Yeah, it's difficult also because I don't think, I mean, Schinkel, he was seeing so much on this itinerary. Like, he came straight from the Advocates Library, which he admired very much. And I don't even think he had a full awareness of which parts were Adam's original design. He probably knew that Playfair had made adjustments, but yeah, I think the subtlety is lost on him.
I don't want to hog the mic, but one last thing. I'm interested in Cockrell's rudeness about Playfair's design, because they both collaborated on the National Monument at Calton Hill. And in fact, Cockrell acts as a conduit for Playfair to give advice to the owners of UCL about how to design the university. So it's interesting to see that. I might talk to you later if I get this.
Thank you. What was Playfair's response or reaction to these criticisms?
Well,
Did it influence him in any way in the design of the National Gallery and the Royal Academy?
No, I don't believe so. Again, because these were private remarks in diaries. So I haven't, at least in the archive, I haven't found any evidence that they communicated to Playfair directly. Yeah, but it's something I will look into. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more. There's one over here and then one over there.
Thank you. I really enjoyed both papers. And my question is to Rebecca about this cost of windows and of glass. And I wondered if this large number of variety of windows in the examples you showed was a deliberate sign of that wealth, if it was intended in that way. If there's evidence of that.
So I haven't found evidence that they, like written evidence that, oh, we're going to show off by how much glass we have. But I mean, this is the same era that windows are being closed up in buildings in London, in tenements, or tenements are being built with fewer windows. So I think culturally people would have just understood. I think the opening into the seasonally glazed conservatory at Luscombe, the one by John Nash, I think that one window cost, I can't remember how much it cost, but it was, more than vast majority of people in the country were making in a year. So we're talking about one window, and there are so many windows there. And I think a window of that size, I think actually counted as more than one window, because if it was over a certain size, then it was classed as more than one window. So I think culturally people would have understood how much money this is showing. I mean, because actually John Nash's own house on the Isle of Wight had 2 conservatories on the garden front. And later John Summerson came and described it as, it looks like it was entirely glass, that it was entirely glazed front. And you can just imagine the light reflecting off of these, or even, you go to Chatsworth and you see the light reflected. People would have been very aware of this in a way that I think we take for granted now, all of these windows. But I think people would have very much been aware that that is money that is allowing that to happen.
Yes, I was wondering whether with the expansion of use in glass and Schinkel's theatre is quite extraordinary. It's almost like a greenhouse conservatory. Whether there was any awareness of Hardwick Hall, which was a big house with all glass and no wall.
Yeah.
And did anyone write about it or visit it? And
I wish that it was on his itinerary, because it would make such a nice addition to the story. But and unfortunately, it was not. But I would like to think that he was maybe aware of it. One footnote on the theater: it was not executed as it was depicted in the Sammlung. This is something that happened a lot with Schinkel's buildings. That those engravings of his buildings that are so famous, that's his idealized view of the buildings as they should have been executed. And this glass, like you said, a greenhouse shell for a theater, it proved to be a very costly design. And so they weren't able to execute it to his specifications.
Also in Hamburg on the Baltic Sea,
yeah,
it would have been freezing.
Can I just jump in? I mean, it's kind of somewhat related in terms of just Schinkel showing it as he wished that it had been. I mean, John Sohn, architect, rethought projects long after they'd finished, long after he'd moved on to other things. He would obsessively rethink, and his publications, you have to be a bit wary when he talks about things, because he talks about it in the way that he would like it to have been. But actually at Pitsanger, which is his little country house in Ealing that you can now visit. They reopened it a few years ago, and for many years, so from 1901 until just a few years ago, it was Ealing's public library, but it's been restored, and it's a good way of seeing Sohn's work. The Sohn Museum is so full of things, and this is Sohn stripped back with nothing in it. But actually, he made a watercolor proposal of making the conservatory, the attached conservatory in the back, double height. And if you see an image of it, it looks like a modern skyscraper. I mean, it looks, you can't tell if it was going to be divided on the interior or whether it was going to be this extremely high ceilinged idea, but it's this kind of obsessing and wanting to tell this, you have your legacy, tell your own legacy. And
one very quick question.
I'm interested in the dividing glazing bars and the way that they're used in both of your examples, all of the examples actually. But it struck me that in Schinkel's drawing, he omitted any glazing bars,
exactly,
which obviously the classics didn't have any glazing. And I was told, with reference to Robert Adams' work in London, that glazing bars were often painted black. And I wondered if you've got any knowledge about this, and that the intention being that from the outside, the appearance is large panes of glass and not individual small panes of glass. But of course, nowadays, as we can see from that, we always paint them white or some kind of light color to emphasize them. But in those days, so any thoughts on or
very
shed
short
any
answers
light on
only.
it?
We're fine. We're fine. I don't have comments on the period. I haven't looked into the glazing bars, except that, no, Repton, I think, said that glazing bars, or at least window frames, should be painted green from the outside. So I know there was that, but it's actually interesting that you say that, because I know there was someone in the present day now who is building a country house in a classical style and was in kind of discussions / arguments with the architect because they didn't want any glazing bars. And their argument was that in Palladio's prints, it's just an open black void. And whereas the architect was saying, but to be appropriate to the period, if you were, if this is actually a neoclassical building, 18th century style, let's say, it needs to have glazing bars. You can't just have it be one solid piece of glass. And I thought it was an interesting argument both ways, because, if you're really trying to look like a Palladio print, then maybe you don't have it. I mean, you could argue that, but if you're trying to actually make it as Palladio would have made it, or as someone in, further forward from the Renaissance, 18th, 19th century, whatever, then you need the glazing bars. But I thought it was kind of an interesting argument on the part of the patron to want this.
Yeah, I think, well, we can talk more about it in the break maybe, but I'll just say that in the theater building, this is another case where his desire kind of outpaces the available funds and maybe the technology, but he says that he wanted to have iron. He wanted to have the glass set within iron, so the profile could be as small as possible, painted, and I believe painted black, so it would essentially disappear.
And I think in architectural drawings, that is quite a familiar convention, that you leave out that detail in presentation drawings,
Yeah.
A. B, of course, there is the history of the ever diminishing size of the glazing bar, so it becomes finer and finer during exactly the period we're looking at. Yes.
Windows.
Yeah.
The window looks black rather than clear.
Yeah, very good point. Well, look, I think I'm obliged to wrap you up as the convener, because people must have a chance to go and find their lunches around the place. I think you need to be back here at 2:00 for the resumption of, or make it 5:02, just to be on the safe side.
So just to clarify, this is an hour break for you to go find lunch. There are lots of places around here. Hopefully that's enough time for you to grab a bite and then be back and ready to get into panel 3.
But I'd very much like to thank our speakers, Rebecca and Stephen, for really wonderful presentations and discussion. Thank you so much.